welcome to this session on the future of EU-UK relations. Very gratifying indeed to see such a large audience for such a seemingly dry topic on a Sunday morning. My name's Fiona Wishlade. I'm one of the vice chairs of the European Movement in Scotland. We've got a great lineup of speakers and panellists here today.
Thank you, and yes, this is the other side of me. When I'm not looking at global trade, I'm spending time in London and Brussels, and therefore spending a lot of time thinking about UK-EU relations. And just in case you can't place the accent, yes, I am as Scottish as Scott McTominay, literally. So if he can be Scottish, having grown up about 3 miles away from where I grew up, then so can I.
He's in Italy now.
Anyway, so this is more thinking about it, UK-EU relations, because obviously it was never quite the same in Scotland. But in terms of UK-EU relations, in terms of Westminster, in terms of Whitehall, there's a very different mood today as compared to 2016. What are the differences? From seeking distance then to seeking closer ties now, most obviously. From the momentum being with anti-EU voices to now the energy being on the side of the other side. From expecting special deals to realising now that the EU really sets the terms of engagement. From global Britain to geography matters again. From treating the EU as the enemy to referring to them as partners. From expecting the US to be saviours to Trump. From blaming the EU for everything to blaming not being in the EU for things. And from a government struggling with negotiations, okay, that one hasn't changed yet. But, you know, what I think is worth being clear on why has this changed is that on its own terms, Brexit failed. The UK has not got lots of trade deals that the EU doesn't, and doesn't have a different regulatory model, and no other country left. So in a way, those Brexit promises haven't happened, and whilst the die-hard sort of vote leave leaders keep saying, well, it hasn't properly been done yet, Brexit, you know, they're not trying to say that very much. The correct understanding is the reality kind of got in their way. Geography matters, business wants strong ties to local markets, governments need to discuss the many issues of common interest. The EU, wider Europe, remains by far the UK's most important trade partner, although we have shifted more from goods to services exports because of the nature of the barriers that have gone up. And UK goods companies in particular have fallen out of European supply chains. There's no doubt that there's been an economic hit. There are various estimates ranging from 1% to 8% of GDP. They are big numbers, whatever they are. Let's stick with the 4% that the Office of Budget Responsibility has gone with. And that is why the Labour Party already prioritised a reset, though relations did start to improve under Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. And I think as well, in the current reset, there was a need to test what would happen when a constructive UK government went to Brussels and actually tried to talk in a reasonable way. And so you start the negotiation because you had a lot of bitterness. It's hugely underestimated in London in particular, just how much bitterness was caused by the way the UK approached Brexit, even the very fact of Brexit, but then to kind of basically yell and shout around Brussels about how they were terrible and we'd do much better, you know, it left a very bitter taste. So it may not look much, a food and drink agreement, youth mobility, linking emissions trading schemes, they may be modest in economic terms. Participation in the energy single market will be a much bigger deal, but you had to start somewhere, and that was a reasonable place to start. Those negotiations are progressing reasonably, but there was a setback when the UK was not included within the defence funding scheme SAFE. Both sides took a little bit of responsibility for not quite setting that up correctly, so there's still quite a bit of nervousness between the UK and the EU in terms of how they're dealing with each other. But also what we found out, I think now more clearly than ever, is what the basis is for future UK-EU ties, which is the UK will have to make a financial contribution, accept greater, if not and possibly full, freedom of movement of people, and generally be positive about the EU, preferably by going to Brussels and saying so. Now, That doesn't come as much of a surprise to those of us, I mean, on the panel, several people on the panel will have known this for some time, but London wasn't by and large listening. And now I think the message is finally starting to come through. And then you get this renewed conversation in Westminster and Whitehall and think tank groups saying, okay, so what do we do now from this point? The government is suggesting more alignment with Brussels in terms of various regulations, but it still wants to pick and choose which areas, and the EU is not keen on that. And in fact, there is no real evidence that there's a regulatory dividend available at all. This idea that you can kind of regulate differently to the EU and grow, but on the other side of the coin, companies will be less inclined to invest if you can't sell your goods and services so easily because there are barriers. And at best, they probably cancel each other out, and at worst, it's actually probably actively damaging to regulate in a different way. So there probably just isn't that regulatory dividend anyway. But that's where the government is, and it doesn't look like, even after the local election results last week, that will change anytime soon. The Liberal Democrats proposed a customs union earlier this year, but there's every reason to assume that that's not easily available. You still have to give money, you still have to have something around people. And that would obviously reduce UK control over trade policy. Some people are now talking about Swiss style, which is a series of agreements which in effect you're almost in the European single market but not quite, and you have a few opt-outs. Switzerland has a new agreement with the EU that was negotiated, finalised last year, which will probably go to a referendum in Switzerland. There is some argument as to whether that's really available to the UK or not. It's hard to tell, but would it be even something the UK would want? And therefore, given that there's not obvious halfway houses, people are starting to talk about membership again, in a serious way, and you'll see a lot of chatter in the last few days, and probably in the next few days, that the UK should rejoin the EU, or the Labour Party should propose this at the next election as a way of uniting its support. So let's see what happens. I mean, there is opinion poll support across the UK for that policy position. It's probably shallow, and I suggest as well that it's also, there is support across EU member states that is also shallow. There's a lot of that distrust still remains. So if the UK applied to rejoin and said, but we want lots of opt-outs, I don't think there would be much interest in Brussels. If the UK genuinely wants part of the European project again, that's a different story. But equally in the UK, is there really that level of support for being part of the European project? There certainly is more. I mean, Scotland is different. Scotland, there is a more emotional feeling, I think, of being part of Europe. That simply isn't the case in large parts of England and Wales. But people are feeling it more because of Trump. Trump is making people in England and Wales feel more European. So there is a possibility that rejoin comes back onto the agenda. Now, clearly there's some difficulty as well with reform, and their suggestion of leaving, and the Conservatives of leaving the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which would cause total chaos in UK-EU relations. So it's very much in flux at the moment, but those possibilities that were not there even a year ago are now there. There are other pressing issues as well to be mentioned. The shared challenges on economic security and defence, where we may see new agreements. Europe as a whole is thinking about its whole economic future, issues like the declining steel industry as compared to China. What do you do about that? You know, in theory, you should be able to get joint working, but can the UK and the EU quite get to that point? There are obstacles, but it might happen. What I think is clear by now as well is there's a permanent negotiation between the UK and the EU, whether you're in or out. And that obviously also changes things. So it's not a case of how do we avoid that. We are inevitably going to be in a negotiation, whether it's about energy, migration, trade issues. You can be in the room with the other EU member states, or just as a third country along with all the other third countries. And that's the choice that you have to make. That, though, is progress, I think. And in a way, this is what happens in trade negotiations. The UK has in effect spent 10 years testing the EU red lines to see whether there are any special deals available. And it has discovered, 10 years on, that the answer is no. So now it's up to the UK, and potentially later you'll talk about Scotland, to decide what to do now we realise there's no special deals available.
So we're made up of 51 chambers across the UK, and Edinburgh, and Glasgow, and Aberdeen and Grampian, and Inverness, and Ayrshire are particularly powerful in that respect. We have a really strong membership across the UK, and regularly surveying members to examine their views. We also have 72 chambers as part of our international network across the world, and the really significant ones: the British Netherlands Chamber, British Norwegian Chamber, the British Chamber in Belgium, and the EU as well, British Chamber in Germany. So that's all part of this sort of family of British chambers, and roughly our reach globally is 300,000 companies, 50,000 in the UK. So, in the wake of recent developments, and particularly the Mays lecture, which the Chancellor gave in March, we wanted really to survey our members and find out what business views were about the option of default alignment, which is what the Chancellor outlined in her speech. And we presented this to the House of Lords European Affairs Committee in an evidence session a month ago, and it made for a very interesting session. So I'll outline what businesses said in early April. Okay, so the first question that we asked them was, if a position of default alignment across economic sectors were introduced, would that help your business trade, grow, or would it have the reverse effect? 44% of businesses overall saying that it would somewhat or significantly help. Hinder, you get 14%. 24% saying wouldn't make any impact, perhaps because they're not exporting companies, although a good chunk of BCC members export, around 40%. And 16% didn't express a view, they were unsure. So overall, that's 44% to 14. So it's not a majority. I think if you did take out the no impact, it would be a majority of those who were going to be impacted by trade with the EU in the sample. But still, a significant plurality of companies expressing a view in favour of default by alignment. And then if you look at exporters, the figures are particularly stark. So 56% of exporters saying that it would help them grow their business if there was that policy of alignment by default, against 19%. So that is a majority of exporters, clear majority of exporters, saying that they would prefer a position of alignment by default. Slight different position if you take non-exporters, so still a plurality in favour of alignment by default, but a bit less. We've got 33% of non-exporting companies saying that they would favour alignment by default, and 16% of companies saying that they felt that would hinder their business growth. 32% saying it wouldn't make any impact, not surprising, quite a big bar there because that's a non-exporting cohort, and 18% saying they're not sure. So even with non-exporters, there is still a plurality, still by 2 to 1, of companies expressing a view saying that alignment by default would be a better option for them. We then asked, were there any regulatory areas where closer alignment with EU rules or standards would negatively affect your organisation? 51%, a majority, said no. So remember, that was any regulatory areas that we asked about, including in services as well as goods. So clear majority saying no. Sorry, 13% said yes, and we had a whole list in terms of the sort of free text responses of some individual measures, some about customs, some about origin still, some about specific EU regulations, EU deforestation regulation, etc. So, but no overwhelming issues, just a collection of individual matters being raised, or senses or vibes being raised about alignment from that 13% minority. 35% said they hadn't considered it, but overall, that is a clear majority from that sample, expressing the view that they did not see a downside to alignment by default. We look at the exporter and non-exporter split again, so 56% of exporters clear that they would favour alignment by default, 21% against, saying there'd be issues, 24% saying they hadn't considered what matters might arise. Non-exporters a little bit different, but not far from the majority line, 48% of non-exporters saying that they didn't have any issues with alignment by default. 13% saying that they did, 40% saying they hadn't considered it. So I think you're beginning to put together a fairly interesting body of what business views are here. Yes, it does depend how you ask the question, but businesses very much looking for pragmatic further progress, accepting there will be benefits from what is likely to get over the line by the time of the Leaders' Summit this year, perhaps by early July, in terms of things like SPS, helping our food and drink and plant industries, the emissions trading scheme deal that will help the competitiveness of steel and other sectors and remove charges from the EU CBAM that otherwise would apply from next February. The electricity deal, which will be very good for investment for renewable sectors, but also contribute to pan-European energy security in a very good way, and the youth experience deal as well. Most gave fairly broader political responses to the issue about alignment. There were some people who perhaps slightly thought that alignment meant more EU rules, in the way that the question might be put when the UK was an EU member. Clearly some views being stated, but no massive issues in particular. A string of individual concerns rather than 3 or 4 coming up constantly in that quantitative and qualitative analysis. So there were some that we would flag up. So Employment Law, Working Time Directive, environmental and chemical regulation, some issues around product standards, design standards as well, were some which were mentioned. There is a very clear sense in this survey about trade-offs, a recognition that regulatory autonomy has to be given up in many sectors of the economy if this approach could be negotiated and turned into an international agreement with the EU. And some companies were aware of those trade-offs and supported nevertheless. Other companies were a bit less sure about what the trade-offs would involve. What do these survey conclusions, I think, take us to? Well, a sense that business wants to be more ambitious about the reset, that we see in areas like chemicals, pharmaceuticals, automotive, real advantages in government pursuing an alignment deal with the EU in these sectors. These do not give, particularly for automotive, the whole solution to the challenges that it faces. In terms of things like rules of origin, there's a big cliff edge coming at the end of this year, so that's got to be addressed. Otherwise, we get 10% tariffs on each other's electric vehicles from January, which is in no one's interests. There are also some customs issues as well around automotive, which would not automatically be addressed by an alignment by default policy. But I think you can see from this that businesses which have been at the front line of dealing with the extra cost, dealing with the extra red tape, seeing the reductions in trade, are very pragmatic but also extremely ambitious about where they want this next stage of the relationship to go to. So that was evidence that we gave to peers. We hope to be giving evidence to MPs soon about where to take things. But we would identify, I think, as David indicated there, clearly around mobility, to get to an outcome where you have an alignment mechanism, where you have reductions in red tape, fewer trade barriers, that is going to need further action around mobility. If you look, for example, recently the EU signed a trade deal with Australia that in a sense, has a sort of form of mini free movement, up to 4 years, no age limits, no job offers required, some additional flexibility on welfare and benefits in comparison with the UK Australia arrangements and the UK EU arrangements. So the bar is being raised, I think, in a sense of what is going to be done. And clearly this issue about mobility is one that will have to be addressed seriously by the UK government if it's going to make much more progress than the areas that we talked about in terms of resolution for this July. But business is up for it. We recognise there is big potential for economic growth. Before the committee recently, we quantified how much economic growth would come just from the 4 deals likely to be reached either by July or by later in the year in terms of the electricity market deal. And you're looking at between 0.4 to 0.59% additional GDP growth per annum. And when our economy is struggling to get above 1% growth per year, that is not to be sniffed at. Considerable benefit can flow. And if you look at the fiscal benefits of just those deals, not even going into the areas we've talked about with our survey here, you're looking at between 12 to 18 billion pounds worth of additional revenues coming into the Exchequer as a result of that greater alignment deal. So there is a significant prize here for business, significant benefits for growth, significant ability to restore pan-European supply chains and markets again, and I hope that our survey of members is a really interesting and strong contribution to what will be a debate that will run through this year and probably for the rest of this decade. Thanks a lot.
Hi everybody. It was interesting to note a little bit of a cynical thread through some of David's remarks, and I'm going to end up being a little bit more cynical than that. Because, so just for a brief introduction, before I went into government, I had a role very similar to William's. I sort of headed up trade and EU policy for the Institute of Directors, and we would have very similar sort of findings very often. Spent a couple of years in government as a civil servant working on our trade agreements, and then subsequently was sort of asked to stay on as a policy advisor to the previous Secretary of State for Business and Trade, who was currently the leader of the opposition. We were pretty clear, about what the contours of working within government was at that point. No one wanted to talk about doing sort of prioritising trade with Europe, which I found quite frustrating. We did a little bit of talk about sort of market access barriers and how we could sort of look in the areas where individual member states had competence, but obviously there was no appetite to kind of reopen anything with the EU. And since then I've gone back into sort of working with businesses in a consultancy role. And I think when I hear some of the figures that are sort of quoted, my cynicism comes from the same cynicism that I have when I hear figures that are quoted about kind of the people who have changed their minds on Brexit and so forth. And I think the question that I would have is the cost of going through that rigmarole again. How vocal are businesses going to be to sort of really push for that ambition? I think it'd be a great idea to sort of lift up the ambition that we have currently, because even if you look at sort of the agri-food sort of SPS agreement, I spent a lot of time with farmers, and there's an interesting difference between the farming constituency in the United Kingdom and, let's say, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where they're very domestically focusing on their sort of, feeding the nation. There's not a big prioritization of export. Very, very different in my home country and other sort of big markets around the world. And so, I spent a lot of time with farmers trying to sort of work through what the potential costs and benefits are of the SPS agreement. And because they don't see themselves as exporters, they say, well, that's the retailer's sort of argument. And so that's a different kettle of fish, which we might come back to about where's the sort of regulatory sovereignty and market access trade-off for something like the farming sort of sector. There is a pass-through effect, but they don't necessarily see it as much as they could. So I think it's important to lift up the ambitions writ large about where else do we want to look at sort of growing trade with the EU as a whole. My cynicism comes from how much are people invested in to want to drive that? How much are businesses going to really drive sort of that ambition? I mean, if you look at some of the areas for the goods sectors, I think, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has talked about chemicals on and off sometimes. I know, and I think William alluded to it, some of the chemical sort of sector has some sort of concerns about what that would exactly look like. If you look at the services sector, I've spent a lot of time engaging with the government at the moment, and I think the services sector, the most important thing for the services sector fundamentally at the end of the day is probably free movement. Are we going to get that? Maybe we might do incremental versions of what Australia is doing. And so I think for me, I've always been, as a very unrepentant Remain voter, someone who cares about trying to get to an even keel, albeit, noting what David said about constantly negotiating with you, an even keel with our European friends and partners. I don't want to have to constantly redo things. And I think one of the reservations I had about the framework with which Labour were sort of draping this sort of reset is that the bigger deal you make something about it, the more attention it gets. And I'm someone who's very outcomes focused when it comes to trade. Sometimes I think that the best way of making progress on trade and just cooperation with our European neighbours is not actually shouting about it. And I know that sounds totally counterintuitive, but for example, if you look at sort of the issues around sort of energy, sort of security and energy policy, there are clearly shared challenges that we have to, regardless of what the structure of our relationship is with the EU, we need to sort of problem solve that together. And I've always been a bit more of a pragmatist post-Brexit to say we need to frame the way in which we repair our relations with, not just for the sake of it, because I think that attracts some of the criticism about relitigating Brexit, but there are clearly issues here that we need to work through together. So sometimes I'm more of a pragmatist when it comes to trying biting off different pieces rather than putting it all back together again, because I think that is the way to get progress. And I realize that makes me a cynic, but also an optimist in terms of outcomes. Sorry. It is. I should say, we'll get to the Scotland part of it. Despite the accent, I do live just outside of Dundee, but we'll come to that afterwards. But for me, it really is, I want to see progress, and I think the biggest concern that I have, both from a business and just a sort of interested observer, is that I can see what might be coming in 2 or 3 years' time, and I don't want all this hard work to be undone. So for me, the most important thing is getting to an even keel with our European neighbours.
Yeah, sort of balancing what is absolutely essential. So our company represents, as I said, I'm the president of the Scottish Energy Forum, and that really is, we create debate, we create platform. We're not a lobbying organisation, and we're very much into, the hydrocarbons. How do you get to 2050 and do that in a balanced, managed way? Because we have to get there. But we then need policy and regulatory and relationships, and the price of electricity, etc., that will enable us to invest and develop the renewables that we need, because that is actually a choking point. And one of our members is going to be setting out a paper on that. It's going to be called Blend and Decline, which will really look at a very, very deep look at every single aspect of it going forward. And I think that will, whether there's pieces need to be aligned there with Europe, we'll have to discuss. But the other side of our business is we do algorithms for observing what people are putting up into lower Earth orbit and into what is geostationary. And basically lower Earth orbit is primarily the constellations that you get internet from. The geostationary tends to be our military, or we call them the big birds. That's a very kind of geeky name for it. But we do have, so we're doing that kind of work, and really it's about security and defence. How many of us are all looking at mobile phones or paying online, etc.? How much do the satellites that are up there, do we depend for stability? If something went down, if something were attacked here, then people wouldn't be able to pay at the cash desk with their cards and their phones anymore. They would just take the stuff off the shelf, and God help you if you want to go out and shop for those, right? So, because there'll be social unrest. I mean, that's another issue. But to say these are really important areas, and and we've also got AI, and we need to be staying ahead of it. We need foundation models. There's another big discussion there which will go. We need to have the brains in Britain. Our universities need to have the people here. So I think we're back to your point, which is actually having mobility, getting the people coming here easier to come. As a business, you take one person. If we find one person with no family, no dependents, it's £7,000 we have to pay for the NHS we stump up, because you could say to them, oh, you've got an NHS bill of about £4,000, come and work in Scotland. for the pleasure of doing that. And they'd say, why should I? I came from a French grande école, or I'm working for some big company in Germany or Italy or somewhere else in Europe, and just for the pleasure of coming to Britain and to Scotland, we have to foot that bill. And if they have a partner and maybe 2 kids, then that bill suddenly becomes £17,000 you have to upfront to bring that individual with their family to Britain in order to contribute to these really cutting-edge areas, important strategic defence and security areas that we have in Britain. And every member of the Aerospace Defence Security Body, every member of the Scottish Space Space Cluster will tell you the same thing. And people trying to work in AI, really at the cutting edge, it is a brain, it's a brain race, and we need to attract them here. So these are the issues, but I think there we could do quite nicely. There are other things, and I think maybe the Mark Carney model of let's just have relationships that make sense, pragmatic relationships that make sense. I've just come from, and I'll pass on the mic now, we can talk about it later, but I've just come from the NATO Centre of Excellence, where the USA has a joint commercial operations. They're working under the radar, if you like, of maybe certain policies coming from the USA, and still able to communicate and collaborate across the world, actually, but within NATO states. So NATO is very important at this point in time, and I don't really see when we can collaborate with our European partners doing those capabilities and bringing them together. So that's just to throw into the mix. For me and for our tech area, the real issue is getting the brain power here, because if we don't get it, they're going somewhere else.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm the Scottish Government Director for External Affairs, but for the last 5 years I've been our diplomat in Brussels, leading the team there. And for my sins prior to that, I was part of the Brexit negotiations. So just a few reflections, I think, on state of play. Some of this we may come back to after the break, but there's been a clear improvement in the relationship between the EU and the UK since, I would say, the Windsor Framework was signed in early 2023. And we've seen some important steps forward. William touched on some of the things which have either been agreed or are in train, and the Scottish Government really welcomes that progress. Of course, we'd like it to go further and faster. One of the big changes fundamentally is the UK Government's willingness to do dynamic alignment or to follow EU law, which will be fundamental to getting an agreement on SPS, energy emissions trading, potentially other areas. One reflection I would have, it goes back to something David said, is about the EU's willingness to talk about aligning and doing deals in specific areas. So this used to be sort of known as cherry picking and was very much frowned upon. I think there has been some change and a bit more flexibility on that. I think EU officials often talk now about the balance of rights and responsibilities in a balanced package. In other words, if you're willing to follow laws and in some cases make some kind of financial contribution, then there's more openness. So I think that the Prime Minister has spoken about looking at other areas where it may be possible to align. And I think the Scottish Government, our position is to support alignment. We passed legislation on that in 2022. George and Cicella here are very involved in that work. So I think we're interested in looking at that. One thing I would say, a couple of things actually. One is alignment goes along with allowing your technical guys to be involved in rule making. In other words, being in the room to sort of input as new rules are brought forward. So whether it's Norway, Iceland, whether it's Switzerland, they can be involved in that. They don't get a vote on it. We need to make sure that we're able to be involved in decision making going forward in some of these areas, and I think Scotland has a lot to offer in some of these technical areas. The other thing I think is we need to be, and it goes back, Ali, to what you said, we need to be doing deals that will stick for a period of time, where there's confidence on both sides that political change in the future will not unpick some of the things that are agreed. Now we need that kind of consistency. One of the features of the first couple of years after Brexit was a lack of trust between the two sides. That has been gradually rebuilt, I would say, over the last 3 years. But that trajectory needs to continue in order to have the right conditions for further progress.
Because we heard so much about during the Brexit sort of years about facts by democracy, and the irony is that I can recall when I first started out in Parliament, the original Brexiteers were all for Norway and all for Switzerland, and then it got trashed through the sort of Brexit negotiations. And so I think actually highlighting, particularly perhaps from the Norwegians, and I know the Swiss have just done their new SPS agreement, well, multiple new agreements with the EU, but that ability to sort of, and the importance of how technical input can shape things from a non-EU member state, not just about the vote, is really important to highlight.
Thank you. Well, good morning everybody, and thanks Fiona for describing me as far left. I think that's the first time I've ever been described as that. But
Depends where you're sitting from the audience, if you're on the far right.
It's all relative, it's all relative. But I agree much on what's been said, and a couple of observations from me. Firstly, if you don't know what you want, you're not going to get it. And if there's no leadership, you're going to guddle around with consequences rather than direction. And where the UK has been making some progress, I very strongly agree, there has been a change in tone with the new Labour government, there obviously has. And there has been progress on some nuts and bolts stuff. I'm really concerned about things like dynamic alignment, because the people who used the democratic deficit of the EU to make the case for Brexit will have exactly the same argument to make again, because dynamic alignment is a democratic deficit on stilts. And we can be involved in the technical stuff, and we should be, and we will be, I don't doubt. It is the policy of the SNP government to dynamically align, but it's our policy to get back into the EU. If the UK does not show some leadership on this to sell it to people, we've got precisely the people who sold Brexit in the first place saying that they've got all the answers for what needs to come next. And that's really dangerous, because if we contemplate the idea of a reformed UK government, nobody in Brussels is going to take us seriously, because anything that we do sign up to is going to be trashed. And that will be bad for everybody. So the SNP has supported the Windsor Framework, we've supported dynamic alignment, we support anything that gets us closer into the EU, but if we're not actually going to make the case for Europe in the UK, it's not going to be safe, it's going to be vulnerable to future unpicking. And struck by David's phrase that we're in constant negotiations with the EU, that's what the reality is going to be on everything. So if we don't actually sell the principle of membership, we're always going to be on the back foot, and it's going to be vulnerable to further unpicking. And I fear that's just going to unravel the whole process.
So you brought in this whole idea of the power we had and the relationship we have. And, you know, I spent yesterday actually with the Alliance Française and the Goethe Institutes, and there's a Polish faction, there's a Polish group there on languages, etc. Because my degree is language and literature at Glasgow Uni. And you might say, so what? But actually, you know, one of the things I'm trying to impart to our governments and to our families and you know, working with the different institutes of language, trust. Human beings, I mean, I even had my partner asking me, well, you know, people just put it into a machine. And it's like, you know, well, no, I'm sorry. The fact that I could actually speak, I had learned 12th century French and German language. I mean, I can say words in Mittelhochdeutsch, right? I can. And I read Eric Guénide and Chanson de Roland in the original text. I mean, when you walked into France, I mean, my whole career was based on this. You know, it wasn't just that I got to France and I studied in Germany and I worked in Germany. But I was hired by companies, and particularly large British companies, who were trying to bridge that gap. I mean, it was 1986, and they thought, God, we've done nothing about being part of the EU. And they were hoovering people up with languages. Would you like to be an accountant? No, thank you. Would you like to work with ICI polyurethanes and go to Brussels and help introduce CFC-free flexible phones, which, you know, will not damage the ozone? Yes, please. And why was that possible? And why was I successful? And iteratively, because when I walked into the French managing director, you're probably this British woman, right? No, je suis écossaise. Ah, bravo. And then I could talk about their culture. And so you built that trust. The walls came down instantaneously. The same thing in Germany. I mean, I would walk in there and, you know, I couldn't use the I'm Scottish thing, I quite liked it, but it was more, I would start quoting Walter von der Vogelweide, and Rita so gelehrt was, as alles was in Bücher las. And instantly the walls came down as well. But I use this because there's actually we've got a fantastic consular corps here. And I heard one of them, and I won't say because obviously Chatham House, say that they were present in Brussels when this was happening, and they have never seen the entire European sort of diplomatic corps in Brussels could not believe that a nation would throw away so much power. And when you see, and my analysis when I look at what's going on now, because again, we're all saying we haven't got a defence, the defence review, the defence review was ready in February 2025. Our company was waiting for it to come out, especially for space, and it had to be binned because the premise of the biggest ally that we had, we might not be getting those impacts we had. And then when we turned around to try and see those wonderful, powerful, trusted relationships, which we had also trashed in the last 10 years, trying to build, of course, but really not paid much attention until about, the new government came into power. How are we going to build that fast? So, I really, and then you've got the population, we're not doing enough fast enough down in Westminster. When actually, we're actually having to build some of the foundations of our relationships. And I will quote, and I believe that, and again, I love the Mark Carney position. I love the fact that Macron goes to South Korea and says, we are prévisible. You can count on us, and it's through those relationships that we'll bring balance back to the world into something that has gone skewed. So I think if we have those relationships, one case in point was the Iranian war, and where we were asked by President Trump if we could launch from the Chagos Islands, and that was a dilemma because saying no is not a good thing, right? But then who stepped up? The Monday morning after that weekend, Macron announces the 8-party nuclear deterrent, and on the Tuesday morning, Keir Starmer was able to say, well, actually not, because Britain was part of that 8-party deterrent. But that relationship with France had been built furiously over the previous year since the Macron visit to the UK on his state visit. Again, I won't attribute anywhere where I found that information out, but you can look it up yourself and see the proof. So power is what we need today, and power is what we have to build back. And I think building those trusted relationships is going to give us that power back.
I think there's a great sense, having been in Brussels recently, of a definite change in tone. I mean, as a business organisation, let's say 4 years ago, it was much more difficult to get meetings with senior officials in the European Commission, heads of cabinet level or even cabinet level at all. And we were recently there with our Director General, and we met with Commissioner Kubilius's team, Executive Vice President Sejourné's team, the Trade Commissioner Maros Šefčovič's team. All of that, I think, tells us that there is much greater interest in hearing from UK businesses as third country businesses about this. I think there's also much more of a process I detect going on in Whitehall about the impact of Windsor Framework on certain things. So one does hear, what's the position that business would like the UK government to take on EUDR, for example, on alignment with the AI and security legislation. So I think that is a significant factor still that's leading quite a bit of policy making going on in Whitehall. I think one of the things that we do have to sort of recognise if we do move to a situation where dynamic alignment is more present in more economic sectors is the scrutiny arrangements. I gave evidence at Westminster recently about this. We put forward ideas like having joint committees, restoring a House of Commons committee on European scrutiny. That becomes very important in terms of how the decision shaping is going in practice and what benefits we are getting from being part of these formal decision shaping. There will also be challenges at Holyrood. I mean, the amount of legislation that will come via the SPS agreement is going to be considerable, and it will put pressures in terms of time and resource in the Scottish Parliament as well. So that's something that I think the devolved government and the devolved Parliament will have to explore very carefully. It has an important scrutiny role in all of this. But look, I do think we are in a transformed landscape. This is the opportunity. If we sclaff it at this point, we won't get another one in 5 or 10 years' time, and that's why business has been so insistent upon government at all levels to pursue this now and to pursue it with complete clarity and ambition.
Look, rejoin is now back on the agenda, and it's not for me to be talking to people about how they respond to that, whether actually people should go all out and now make that campaign. But I certainly think that that's now the issue to be thinking about. So okay, yes, all the technical stuff, and yes, Scotland, the SNP always had a different position. But in terms of the whole UK, given what William just said, is there going to be another opportunity like this when you've got a US president who is actively turning everybody onto Europe? The time has changed. 10 years ago, as I say, there's a lot of concern of people who are pro-EU that, but people complain about this, that and the other. When we were members, people would complain about everything to do with the EU. That has changed. That goes when you're no longer members. So in a sense, I think there's a lot of fear still around about, but what if? When, that position has changed. So I would just say, and I'm not the one who's going to be involved in this, but as someone who watches, as someone who is in the UK, someone who's in the EU, and that's where I derive my strength, when I talk to people in Brussels and they say, well, are you really serious? Like, they're making it about freedom of movement, but let's make it about rejoin. Are you actually really serious here or not? And I think that is the big challenge for everybody in the room and around. Okay, how serious, how much do we think we should push this in the next year, two, whatever, basically ahead of the next UK election?
So I want to jump on that very last point about, I suppose you're sort of saying the moment is now, that we have a couple of years and you could really start to get rejoin back on the table. I have a fear about reform government. Now, I don't think that reform they particularly care much either way, but I do think they care about optics, as if you look towards some of the grandstanding of the original Brexiteers. So my question is, to the panel, how can we make greater alignment politically palatable to the English core vote that is still somewhat bitter about joining the EU?
There's been a lot of misinformation about regulation. At first, as of 10 years ago, it was a kind of only Brussels regulate. We only have high levels of regulation because we're part of the EU, free from the EU, we'll have less regulation. But actually, regulation is a global thing. Then it was kind of, we can grow faster if we can set our own regulation. We could never find a regulation that would make us grow faster. Now it's, we need our own AI regulation. Really? Maybe, but it becomes a vanishingly small idea that you're going to, that this is really going to help. Could in theory, better regulation does have economic benefit. If you are, on the other hand, a country which is a trading country, where 50% of your trade is with the EU, if you do something different, you're always going to have a cost to it. And so, literally, we've been missold the regulation. Right, this is my sort of area. So, I think you have to push back on that with a certain amount of confidence. Say, it's not how this is. Everybody regulates, and we will have a better position to determine kind of regulatory benefits as part of the EU than we would do on our own. But I think you've got to start pushing back at some of the bigger, at some of the big statements that have been made and say, actually, this wasn't right. When, as a member of the EU, you have a lot of power to set European and therefore global regulation on your own, you're probably going to lose economically from having that control because companies are not going to invest in you so much if you have different regulation. That's brutal, but it's time. I think it's time to to put down a few of the myths and create a new positive narrative for here's what you want to be. Or not, but I think this is the time now, but it's not the time. I don't think you can go into this half-heartedly. I think that this was the problem in 2016. I was in government at that time, so I wasn't any part of a campaign, but 2016 message, we should stay in the EU, but we should reform the EU. What a lousy, pathetic message. I mean, it's got to be something more than that. It's got to be, we want this emotionally and it's the right thing to do, or just don't bother. Go big, go home, I think what they say.
I think your question was about dynamic alignment, not going back into the EU, but maybe, they're not two sides of the same coin, they are different, as I think Alan alluded to. I think it's a lot easier to unpick dynamic alignment and make the case for the EU than sort of sell it. And I think that some of what David was talking about touches on my nervousness about how you can sell this politically, which is you spend a lot of time myth busting. You're on the back foot. That's exactly what the Remain campaign did, was trying to sort of counter the narrative. And once you've done that, it's hard to come back from that. And you know, whether they, you thought they were lies or not, the Leave campaign was really good at sort of putting the front-facing foot forward about what they thought the problem was and what Leave would actually mean. And it just meant the Remain campaign was constantly having to react and respond and myth bust. Myth busting is not a good way to sell anything. So I think maybe if you had to push for a political narrative, you talk about sort of the ability to facilitate trade. But I come back to the point that I spend, as I said, so much time with farmers, and they don't care about exports. They don't care about trade. They care about what are we doing here at home. And so you have to. I'm a little bit in two places about how much the trade argument, despite the fact that we are a massive trading nation, is actually going to work.
It was a really great presentation that Professor Sir John Curtis gave in Edinburgh a couple of months ago around this, and he really did show the sort of the difference, how you phrase the debate. If it's about lower trade barriers and doing more trade with the EU, then the public tend to support dynamic alignment. If you start to phrase, well, more rules from Brussels or loss of regulatory autonomy, then it pushes back a little bit the other way. Dare I say it went, I think, in Professor John Curtis's figures to 52-48 that we remember so well. So how you phrase this is really critical, and that will be a major comms issue from government. I do expect, with the King's Speech coming this week, that government will be looking to business to make pragmatic and supportive statements around the alignment bill. So you may have seen some of our social media comms from during the week that alluded to that. We'll have further to say on Wednesday when the King's Speech comes. So I think that pragmatic business voice is going to be very important in terms of supporting this crucial bill as it goes through Parliament for the rest of this year. As David said, I mean, a lot of rules are from global standards. So, the issue that, in a sense, there's something unique that the European Union is doing that would be imposed upon the UK through dynamic alignment is not really accurate in terms of the way a lot of the goods economy and even parts of the services economy is going to work. So it will very much depend how public opinion goes on this over the next 6 months, on how government, business, the unions and the third sector sell this and react. From our point of view, clear economic benefits, clear benefits for extra tax revenues, also the ability to rebuild our markets. Think about what happened when we've not had an SPS deal for the last 5 years. We've lost, as Professor June Du at Aston University has established, up to around 45% of our trade in many agri-food products with the EU lost. We have the opportunity with the SPS deal to start rebuilding that, as much of a fifth of our trade, as Scottish langoustines return to dinner tables in Paris and other products as well, with the lower costs, with the ending of export health certificates, the reduced waste and the reduced times to get goods to market. It's about the opportunity to rebuild that part of goods trade that's been lost. That's what this reset agenda is about, and that's why business has been very strong in supporting it.
The Scottish Government has, as part of the SNP manifesto for the last government, had a reaction to say, let's get back into and create our own Erasmus scheme like the Welsh Government did, and that was not fulfilled. I, for one, welcome the fact that the SNP decided not to fulfil that promise and instead stick very clear to the values. We're back in Erasmus. We can't keep going on with band-aid, sugly peg stuff. And I think that decision by the SNP not to meet its manifesto, even though emotionally it wanted to, was good. And we need to be calling out the mess created by the UK government very, very clearly. And that's where the values stand. Now, there's many members on the panel here who are talking about sugly pegs, deals around the issue, getting the langoustines back on the plate. That's all welcomed. But we need to clearly say that. Those sugly pegs can be removed if we have a Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, which is looking very likely. And so the Scottish Government, I would welcome the SNP continuing its stance not to clear up the mess created. And yes, if there's a sugly peg, let's say that's a sugly peg that can be removed, and be honest about it.
Thanks, Niamh. The reason why the Scottish Erasmus scheme didn't work was money. It would have been far too big a financial commitment in tough times. And there was also issues about legal competence in that a sub-state was going to struggle to enter into Erasmus without a new agreement on the EU side as well. So it just got too messy. And where Wales did support their scheme, I think it's work in progress as well. So getting back in is exactly where we want to get to. And if there's work that we can do with the UK government to get us into different things, Erasmus is a good place to start. But this is my point about, and it's actually the gentleman's point about how do you sell the benefits of EU membership to the English public? Because if there isn't leadership on this, it's all going to be vulnerable. And it's all going to be able to be unpicked and thrown away. And the idea that British regulations are going to be better than EU regulations, well, that's just mince lads. That's just not serious. And that's now not where the debate is. So there is an opportunity for the UK government, there's an opportunity for the UK parties to really grab this. Now, the SNP policy is clear. We're in favour of independence in Europe. So agree with me, disagree with me, you know what I stand for. I don't know what this UK Labour government does stand for. And we're not going to get salami slicing back into the EU. There needs to be an honest discussion about the benefits of membership. Because I'm really worried that dynamic alignment is vulnerable to misrepresentation in the public debate. And I'm really worried that if it's just bits and bats of budgets here and there, like SAFE or like Erasmus or Horizon Europe, all of that's not actually going to answer the question.
Yep.
So it is political leadership. So if you're involved in any political party, be vocal within it, because there is an argument to be won here.
Just pay tribute really to the fact that there is quite a strong Scottish voice in this. Three gentlemen over there for a starter, and that is important. Clearly, the Scotland policy, as has just been said, is it's different to the UK government policy, but that doesn't mean there can't be an element of Scottish leadership. Frankly, a little bit more reality that comes from perhaps Scottish representatives than sometimes comes from the London one. So just to urge you to carry on doing that, to carry on playing a role in the debate. The fact that you've got you've got a different outcome in mind, that's okay. I think we can, you can work in that way, but you can be constructive, and I think there is an important need across the UK to be more constructive and to have more engagement with Brussels and with the whole EU.